You are listening to a Restoration Obscura dispatch, short explorations from the Field Guide archives. Each mini-episode opens a single file from the archive, fragments of history gathered from the fieldwork of Restoration Obscura. Here's the creator of Restoration Obscura, John Bulmer.
You are listening to a Restoration Obscura dispatch. These are compact explorations from the Field Guide archives, single subjects from the project's fieldwork. Thanks for joining me. This dispatch takes us to Washington Park in New York's capital, Albany. This is a special Halloween episode. It's the time of year when history feels nearer, especially in places where the ground holds more than most people realize. We're not chasing ghost stories, but there are hauntings in history. And in this episode, the unease doesn't come from folklore, but from the facts buried beneath a familiar city park. It's one of the city's most recognizable landmarks. 200 acres of curving paths, statues, and shaded lawns. People walk dogs, jog the outer loop, feed ducks near the lake, and sit on benches beneath trees that have seen more than a century pass. But the park has its other hours after sunset. The corners darken, the same paths that feel active during the day become quiet, uneasy. I've walked across the heart of the park in the dark hours of the morning, and it doesn't feel like a welcoming place. The lights don't reach everything. Some areas feel forgotten, even avoided. The shadows stretch longer, and the landscape takes on a different kind of presence. It's not quite a sense of canopsia. It's something closer to foreboding. Before it became a public park, this was a burial ground. The city's poor, the unnamed, and the unclaimed were laid to rest here. Their graves later became targets for the body snatchers who supplied Albany's medical schools in the 19th century. The place that now serves as the city's recreational heart once stood at the edge of its moral frontier. By the early 1800s, American medicine was in the midst of rapid expansion. The new republic was growing fast. Cities swelling, epidemics spreading, industry reshaping the landscape, and the country needed doctors who could meet a new age of disease. Anatomy and surgery became the twin pillars of medical education, disciplines that demanded direct study of the human body rather than theory alone. By 1800, there were only 4 formally recognized medical schools in the United States: the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, Harvard, and Dartmouth. They were small, elite institutions, modeled after British schools and still tied to apprenticeship-style training. But within decades, that world began to change. By mid-century, new colleges appeared in every major city, many founded by ambitious doctors eager to build reputations and attract students. By 1900, the number had soared past 160. Each of those schools needed cadavers. The study of anatomy wasn't an abstract pursuit. It was tactile, physical, and irreversible. Students were expected to dissect, to learn by cutting, to map the human body through direct observation, yet the law offered almost no legal supply. The only bodies permitted for dissection were those of executed criminals, a tradition inherited from English law. In theory, dissection served as an additional punishment, one that denied a person even the peace of burial. In practice, there simply weren't enough executions to meet the needs of a rapidly expanding medical field. In some states, only a handful of people were executed in an entire year. A single anatomy course could require twice that number of specimens. Meanwhile, public sentiment was fierce. Families viewed dissection as desecration, and the church condemned it as sacrilege. Medical schools that acquired bodies legally still faced angry mobs, and professors who performed public dissections risked their lives as much as their careers. The result was a national shortage that threatened the rise of American medical science. Every school needed cadavers, and almost none could get them through lawful means. A parallel economy developed, one that operated in the dark. In cities from Boston to Philadelphia, from Baltimore to Albany, bodies began to vanish from fresh graves. What started as a desperate solution became an organized trade. Grave robbers working in secret supplied the dissecting rooms of Harvard, Yale, Pennsylvania, and eventually Albany. Doctors needed to teach, students needed to learn, and somewhere someone had to dig. The practice took root around the time Dr. Alden March founded Albany Medical College in 1839. March was a skilled surgeon and an early advocate for medical ethics. Yet even he faced the impossible contradiction of needing bodies for teaching, while the public refused to part with their dead. For his earliest anatomy classes, March reportedly transported cadavers himself from Boston, a dangerous and clandestine effort that underscored the desperation of the time. Across the nation, medicine's pursuit of knowledge was being built atop a trade in the dead. Professors who lectured on the sanctity of life often relied on criminals, students, and hired diggers to fill their dissecting rooms. Few spoke of it openly. Many saw it as a necessary evil. The State Street burial grounds, which once occupied the land where Washington Park now stands, became the center of Albany's resurrectionist trade. Opened around 1800, it served as a public cemetery for the poor, the marginalized, and the victims of epidemic. It was overcrowded, badly drained, and poorly guarded. Exactly the conditions resurrectionists sought. A typical raid began with quiet reconnaissance. The men, sometimes students, sometimes hired hands, would attend a burial or watch the grounds from a distance, noting when new graves were dug and how closely they were monitored. They paid attention to the details, how fresh the soil looked, whether a headstone had been placed, whether any family lingered, and, most importantly, whether the burial was for the poor. Unmarked plots with simple pine coffins were the easiest targets. The dead buried without ceremony or without someone to guard them were most at risk. Once the grave was chosen, they waited for nightfall. Lanterns were blackened with soot or covered in cloth to dim the light. Tools were wrapped in rags to prevent noise. They moved quickly, often in pairs. One kept watch while the other worked the ground. Rather than digging up the entire grave, they opened a narrow vertical shaft at the head of the coffin, just wide enough to reach the lid. This minimized the amount of soil displaced and allowed them to work with speed. The dirt was piled carefully on canvas so it could be shoveled back cleanly afterward. When the coffin was reached, a pry bar or iron spike was used to crack the lid. If the wood was damp or warped from burial, the boards gave way with a groan. A length of rope or an iron hook was slipped beneath the shoulders or under the arms, and the body was hauled upward through the shaft. This part required care. The body had to come up whole, intact enough to be usable in the anatomy theater. In winter, the cold made this easier. In summer, decomposition complicated the task. Clothing was stripped and tossed back into the coffin. Under 19th century law, the dead weren't considered legal property, but their clothing was. Not removing the garments could turn a misdemeanor into a felony. Leaving the corpse naked helped shield the resurrectionists from the worst of the penalties. Once the body was secured, the shaft was refilled, the soil tamped down, and the site smoothed over with boots or rags. If done well, the grave looked untouched. If done poorly, the ground slumped and the crime became obvious in the daylight. Either way, they were gone in under 30 minutes. The work was cold, dirty, and dangerous, but it paid. A single cadaver could fetch between $5 and $25, the equivalent of several hundred today. Some resurrectionists were professionals. Others were students supplementing their income or supplying their own schools. Many were caught, but few were punished severely. 19th century law treated corpses as neither people nor property. Grave disturbance was a misdemeanor unless clothing or jewelry was taken. The system left resurrectionists legally slippery and morally untouchable. The practice thrived in silence, tolerated by city officials who viewed it as a necessary step toward medical progress. Albany's physicians and educators quietly benefited while keeping their hands clean. It was an unspoken contract between ambition and denial. The city's burial geography mirrored its social order. The wealthy rested in fenced churchyards or private family plots, guarded by iron and stone. The poor were buried in open municipal grounds, exposed to both weather and opportunists. When Albany Rural Cemetery opened in 1844, it became the preferred resting place for the city's elite. A landscape of marble, monuments, and manicured hills modeled after the great rural cemeteries of the era. Families with means disinterred their dead from the old State Street grounds and moved them to rural's pastoral security. Those left behind, immigrants, paupers, and the unclaimed, remained in the city's potter's field, unprotected and largely forgotten. Their vulnerability became institutional. As the old grounds decayed, their oversight vanished. The exodus of the wealthy not only removed physical bodies, but also erased the social visibility that might have deterred exploitation. When the city began transforming the abandoned burial grounds into Washington Park in the 1860s, thousands of graves were supposedly relocated. Records suggest that not all were. In many cases, only headstones were moved. The rest stayed beneath what would become lawns, walkways, and ornamental gardens. By then, public outrage over grave robbing had reached a breaking point. Across the United States, anatomy riots erupted when communities discovered their dead were being stolen. In 1788, New York City saw an uprising known as the Doctors' Riot, where an enraged mob attacked physicians accused of grave robbery. Similar violence followed in Baltimore and New Haven. Albany, curiously, never experienced such an uprising. Some historians believe city officials suppressed the stories to protect its growing medical establishment. Others think the city's working poor simply lacked the influence to be heard. In 1854, after years of public anger and private lobbying, New York State passed the act to promote medical science, known popularly as the Bone Bill. It allowed the transfer of unclaimed bodies from public institutions to medical schools for dissection. Almshouses, prisons, and hospitals became the new supply line. If a body went unclaimed after death, it could be turned over to a medical college within 48 hours. The Bone Bill was meant to end grave robbing, but it formalized exploitation instead. Those who died poor or imprisoned now served medicine in death as they'd served industry in life. Wealth still bought peace, poverty still paid the price. Albany Medical College benefited directly. The flow of cadavers became legal, regulated, and efficient. What had once been an illicit trade became a bureaucratic process, signed and stamped in ledgers. The irony's impossible to ignore. Today, the Alden March Bioethics Institute at Albany Medical College stands in the name of a man who once smuggled bodies to teach anatomy. The institution now leads conversations about medical ethics, consent, and human dignity, the very issues that shadow its own beginnings. Its existence today signals how far the field has come in reckoning with the ethics of medical training, a conversation that institutions like Albany Medical College now help lead. Washington Park conceals this layered and complicated past beneath its calm surface. By day, its lakes and paths feel like a civic inheritance, a gift of green amid the city's grid. But at night, the park reveals a different temperament. The lamps pool light along the paths, leaving the spaces between them dark. The wind moves through the oaks, and the city's noise fades into the distance. It's in those darker corners where the past feels most present. The earth here still holds fragments of those original burials: bone, nails, coffin wood, brick, and lime. When the park was graded, work crews occasionally uncovered remains, quietly reinterred without ceremony. The city built over its own history, layer by layer, until memory was concealed under topsoil. Albany's medical legacy owes much to the nameless. The body snatchers of the 19th century were both villains and instruments, their work feeding the anatomy tables that produced generations of physicians. Yet the cost of that progress was borne by those who had no voice, no wealth, and no advocate. The story of Washington Park isn't simply about stolen bodies, it's about how cities manage discomfort. The transformation of a graveyard into a park was as much psychological as physical. It erased evidence, softened the landscape, and turned a place of exploitation into a place of leisure. To walk the park today is to cross a quiet boundary between memory and forgetting. The ground itself is a palimpsest of lives once unacknowledged. Beneath every step are layers of Albany's past, ambition, inequality, denial, and progress. This is the city's hidden anatomy lesson written beneath the soil of its most beloved park. It's important to note that this dispatch is not an indictment of any current institution, but an exploration of the difficult truths embedded in our medical history and the human costs of progress. You've been listening to a special All Hallows Eve edition of the Restoration Obscura Dispatch. A new full-length Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast is on the way to all major streaming platforms. Thanks for listening. I'm John Bolmer, and until next time, take care. I'm excited to share that my new book, Restoration Obscura's Field Guide to the Night, is now available. This project grew out of the same work you hear on this podcast. It's an immersive history of how night has shaped human experience, from the first sky watchers and their constellations, to the wartime blackouts that changed daily life, to the hidden surveillance networks of the Cold War. It's part cultural history, part personal journey, and it invites us to step beyond today's artificial glow and rediscover what still lives in the shadows. Field Guide to the Night is available worldwide in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.
To support reader-funded storytelling, subscribe on Substack. You can also follow the Restoration Obscura Field Guide podcast wherever you listen for more Dispatch mini-episodes and full-length episodes from the world of Restoration Obscura. Copyright 2025, John Bulmer Media and Restoration Obscura, all rights reserved.